Mr. President, we are now live.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this study session of the City Council. We have a quorum of councilors present, and we may have some others joining us, but I think we'll get started. And we really, as with study sessions, typically there's no actions other than the approval of the minutes, and then that's the only voting action. So we'll start with that. This is the approval of the summary minutes from December 20th of 21. I'll move approval. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Second from Councilor Jones. And any discussion or any corrections? I don't think there would be, but I guess we need to call the roll. So I think Ms. Hinojos, if you'd call the vote, please.
Councilor Bassan.
Yes.
Councilor Davis. I believe he's excused. Councilor Feeblecorn.
Yes.
Councilor Grout.
Yes.
Councilor Jones.
Yes.
Councilor Lewis.
I wasn't a part of that meeting, but yes.
Thank you. Councilor Pena.
Yes.
Councilor Sanchez. I believe he's excused. Oh, there he is. Councilor Sanchez.
Yes.
Thank you. Councilor Benton.
Yes.
Thank you. That passes unanimously.
All right, thanks. We'll now move on to our discussion for this meeting. And this is a discussion regarding the police oversight ordinance. And the intention of the meeting was that we could have a conversation with members of the Civilian Police Oversight Board. So I'd like to have them introduce themselves, and I'll just call them out as I see them here on my screen. Ms. Galloway.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Chantel Galloway. I am acting chair after the mass exodus of a month and a half ago. So here I've been on the board for about 4 years now. And so a little bit of history with it.
Thank you. Dr. Cass.
Yes, I'm Bill Cass, and I've been on the board almost 5 years, and I currently am the chair of the policy subcommittee, and that's been my primary focus on the board. So,
And Mr. Crawford.
My name is Jesse Crawford. I'm currently the newest member of the board. I've been serving, I think it might be coming up on about 5 months now.
Thanks for stepping up. Ms. French.
Good morning. My name is Patty French, and I currently chair the Complaint Review Committee, which since I think October, we've been going through the ordinance line by line by line since we heard about the recommended changes, and we have been working on our recommendations and the changes and edits we'd like to see. So, and I'm the second newest person on the board. I got on the board, I believe, in June of last year.
Thank you. And then we'll have our acting director, Ms. McDermott.
Hi, I'm Diane McDermott. I've been with the agency for over 15 years, currently serving in the interim capacity for director, and generally my title is lead investigator at the agency.
Thank you. And I see Councilor Davis has joined us. Thank you for that. And yeah, I think this is intended to be a fairly free-flowing discussion. I'll just ask if any councilors want to speak first. And perhaps, well, as you know, the bill that we have before us is co-sponsored by myself and Councilor Bassan and Councilor Davis. So maybe if they would like to comment, Councilor Bassan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I guess depending on what everybody else wants and what your pleasure is, I mean, going through Ms. Director McDermott's email, there's quite a few details and questions, and I think it's really a great starting point to what we should look at. And maybe if we can't make the changes that she's suggesting, at least figure out how to communicate to the board why, because I think there are some reasonings on there. But I mean, I've been going through it and I have some markups, but I don't know if there was a different direction, but I think that also with council staff, with Mr. Melendrez and Ms. Coulidon, I think that might be helpful too, as a starting point to kind of nitpick it.
Okay. Councilor Davis, you have any comments on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair or Mr. President. I appreciate that. I'm excited to hear from the members of the board. I know we've all had a chance to hear from individual members, and there are a number of different pieces. So I appreciate the president and the members making time to do this today. I think it's important for us to hear directly from them, but since we can't do that in sort of these open meeting rules, so sort of one-on-one and in these rolling quorums. So I appreciate that. I hope we'll all have a chance to hear from them and take that forward to our next meeting. Thanks.
All right. Just ask Mr. Melendrez if he has any suggestions as far as how we ought to proceed in the meeting. I'm happy to maybe follow along with Ms. McDermott's email if that's, I don't have that in front of me myself, unfortunately, right at the moment, but I'll get it up. Any thoughts, Mr. Melendrez?
Mr. President, yeah, so it sounds like you have a potential framework to work through from Ms. McDermott's email. I'm not sure if there was something that happened in cyberspace or if I was inadvertently left off, but I didn't get that email. So I'm not, unfortunately, I'm not able to help kind of identify issues there or speak through them because I haven't had a chance to review it. But, the other alternative is to maybe I could go through some of the high points of what the ordinance is doing and what the big ticket proposed amendments are with an eye toward what the council is looking to address. And then potentially board members could let us know if we think that those align with what they believe those big tickets to be or not, and any suggestions for what they think might be missing from what the council is looking at in its scope. All this is set to the backdrop of O2178, which is presently in the council approval process. You had one meeting with the full council on that ordinance at your last meeting and entertained a few amendments. You deferred that ordinance in order to continue the discussion, including the discussion that you're about to have here today. So that's kind of the backdrop, and I see you have a hand up from one of the councilors, and so I'll yield so that you can address that and give me direction on how you'd like to proceed.
Sure. Councilor Bassan?
Thank you, Mr. President. So given what Councilor Davis said and what Mr. Melendrez just said as well, just for the sake of, I remember us saying and the board saying at our last meeting, they really wanted to talk with us. So I completely respect, maybe we should just use today to hear from them. And then maybe in office, we can go ahead and kind of dissect that email. I did re-forward it to Mr. Melendrez and Ms. Coulidon for their review, but I still follow your lead, but I'm happy to not necessarily go that route if that's not the best way.
Sure. Well, just as a, again, I didn't see the email either. So I guess maybe we, unless we could bring that up and have that be a guide of some sort, we could just open it up to hear from the board members at this point. And I just want to say quickly that, I want to express my apologies at the last meeting, that the bill had come up, time had arrived at the council, and we did go ahead and, it was on the agenda and we discussed it along with some amendments that are out there for consideration. They're I don't think any of the co-sponsors are tied to those amendments necessarily, but we did discuss each of those and they're just out there for consideration. But Councilor Feeblecorn.
Yes, sir. I was just wondering, I also don't have the email, and so I'm just wondering if somebody could forward it to everyone so we can all follow along.
Well, I think we have two possible courses. One is to follow along with Ms. McDermott's email. The other is just kind of open it up and hear from the board. If I heard Councilor Bassan correctly, is that what you were thinking?
Yes, sir. I think that, I mean, why not hear from the board on what they think we've done so far and figure out where they want us to proceed, and then put all that information together with the email that will, sounds like, be distributed to everybody thereafter, and we can kind of polish it up before the next meeting.
That sounds good. Councilor Jones.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also agree with that. I think we need to listen to the board and see what they have to say, and then we can go from there with what we think we want to do and discuss it with them. But I really would like to hear, because we get to see them quite a bit. We get to see their faces, but I would really like to hear what they have to say specifically.
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, well, why don't we just do that then? Let's just go ahead. You know, again, this is a study session. It's a free-flowing discussion. No decisions will be made here. We won't be voting on anything or changing anything about the legislation or possible amendments, but let's open it up for the board. Acting Chair Galloway, do you want to lead off and get us started?
Sure, I can. So I think that my overarching concern after the last city council meeting and receiving the proposed amendments was that it just seemed like there was a lot of really big changes that were taking place. Some of them seemed as though they came out of left field, and that maybe we were trying to solve problems that may or may not exist, or not solve some problems that exist by just circumventing the problem itself, particularly with the number of board members. I am confused as to why we've not been able to appoint members to this board when we have such a large number of applicants available for consideration for 9 people. I think the last count that I heard was 178 or 180 applicants to this board. Surely we can come up with 4 people out of that large of a application pool. And so my concern with that personally is that we're not looking at the root cause of why we're not finding members to this board. I am personally concerned with the removal of the Citizens Police Academy as a requirement. As far as our training goes, I know that we've talked a lot about that and how burdensome it is, but the CPA is really important training, I think, for anybody who's going to come from the public, right? We are not legislators. We are not members of APD. We don't have this background for a very specific reason, and that's to lend a little bit more context and not leave this community with such a myopic view of what's going on and potential issues that arise within the community and the department and that relationship. And so giving us that baseline training of what the police department has, I do personally believe that should be a requirement. And in fact, contrary to, I think, popular opinion of other board members, I think every time a board member is reappointed, they should go through that training again. I don't think that should be once for a 6-year or potentially 6-year term. It's too important, in my opinion. So I think that needs to remain as a requirement rather than an optional training or a recommended training. I would go back to the budget process for the CPOA being a percentage of APD's budget rather than a standalone and come to the city as everybody else does. I can understand the value in that, but I also think that it's important. It's the argument that we made a few years ago. The independence and the independence and the integrity of this process cannot be dependent upon who is sitting in your chair when you are not, and subject to political whims. It needs to hold its own integrity. And so I would be a strong advocate for reverting that back to the way that the previous ordinance had the budget lined out. There are some things that I think are a little vague. For example, on the current proposed draft that I have, It's on page 5, the first line talking about a representative sampling of incidences, use of force, talking about that. Things like that just need to be a little bit more specific, I think. I have some concerns. Director McDermott and I had a conversation yesterday afternoon. I have some concerns with the board being removed completely from the case review process and leaving that in the hands of one person at the agency because of what I understand to have been problems with the prior to Director Harness, the person who filled the position at that point, kind of stashing cases and not having any accountability. And cases not being reviewed because that individual didn't want them to be reviewed. And so I think the checks and balances are important. However, I think that the solution that we have currently is unmanageable and that there's some work to be done. So one of the things that just kind of in conversation back and forth, Director McDermott and I were discussing is maybe instead of reporting the cases that we back up and pull focus on trends. That's what we should be looking at for policy development purposes. And so rather than looking at individual cases that we are reported, we have reports given to us by the agency on a monthly basis that have to do with how many times a certain SOP has been either violated or a sense that it's been violated by the community, right? Because I think that that can be very telling too. We have a lot of instances where community members have an interaction with a department that feels uncomfortable. It feels uncomfortable to them. It feels uncomfortable to us as a board, but it's not technically a policy violation. Well, maybe that's something we need to look at. That's a trend, right? If we don't like the feel of, and I get in trouble for saying feel, but it is that. We don't like the feel of something, maybe there's some room to tweak. And so being able to look at trends and policies and how many times one comes up is probably a better direction for us to go. So that, I know that there's been some discussion about compensating board members. I personally don't have a dog in that fight. I don't care one way or the other. It would be nice to have some of this time that I take away from work recognized, and there's some value to doing that monetarily. I also didn't sign up to get a check from the city, so it's not super critical on my list of issues that have come into this ordinance. So I agree with Councillor Sanchez's assessment that internal affairs training needs to be a part of our experience. It shouldn't be a recommended training. It needs to be a part of what we're looking at. There's a little bit of confusion, and I don't really know if it's an ordinance thing or if it's a CASA thing, but as to what our role is when we're looking at use of force cases, that's the one that comes up quite a bit as this is where our focus needs to be. But we have absolutely no perception that we affect that process whatsoever. We don't have any concept of if we disagree with the force review board's findings, what our recourse is, how do we address that? We don't seem to have any sense of, well, what happens if another issue is identified within the force review board process that would close that loop of communication with us for something that is so critical to oversight and kind of a cornerstone of why we're all here talking about this today. I'm not sure, other than watching the same thing that the Force Review Board has done, what effect we have on that process. And so I think that there's some tweaking that needs to be done there. So I think just for me, that's probably where I would start with that, is just backing up with the case review stuff, really paying attention to what trainings should be required and which ones shouldn't. Codification of those trainings too, for the same reason that I think the budget should be a percentage of APDs. The idea that what a board member, what Dr. Cass and I experienced 4 years ago versus what Member French and Member Crawford are experiencing or going to experience as far as what trainings there are completed, it's different. It just is. We're not coming at this as a board from the same handbook, really. You know, I don't really know how else to say that. We're not coming at this with the same information and the same tools, because the classes that are offered in the police academy are dependent upon whoever is commanding the academy at that time, whoever is the commander. So laying out at least these things need to be done so that we take away any kind of change that would come with a change in administration or leadership within the department. So with that, I will kick it off to perhaps Dr. Cass, since he's got a long-term view of this as well. Thank you.
Dr. Cass.
Yes, thank you. So I have a little bit different approach to this, and I would like to talk it in kind of an overview of what I think are the three major issues. One, board selection and training. Second is our mission as a board and an agency, or specifically about how we handle citizen complaints and what we do there. So I would say that we should be selecting community members for the board who are specifically motivated to focus on police oversight. And this requires some familiarity with the history of the APD use of force that led to the DOJ. Awesome. And I think it's important to have that history and that understanding of why the council created this board. It went through a lengthy process of creating a task force, first of all, to background research. And I think task force did a very good job of creating a framework for the board. And so framework for the ordinance in general. I think that fundamentally we have a decent ordinance. And some changes in my view. So
Dr. Cass, you're breaking up. Could you see if you could speak perhaps a little bit louder?
Yeah, is that better? If I'm closer? I've had some.
I think so, probably. Thanks.
Is it? No,
Your connection is degrading.
I'm sorry?
It's like your connection's degrading when you speak for some reason.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, is this okay? All right. Okay, well, I'll try to focus. I'll try to get to the microphone. So I think that the other aspect of selecting members is that they have the time to devote to these tasks of reviewing policy and reviewing these serious use of force cases, which Member Galloway alluded to. And then also, I think it's important to deal with police in more than just a ride-along sense. And I think it's useful to be able to have the time, and I think it's important to have the time to be able to attend meetings with APD, such as policy meetings, which I regularly go to. And so I think that it becomes important to, or it's useful to get the information that you get, not just with ride-alongs, but with interacting directly with police. The major problems as well as the field problems. Regarding the mission, I think our mission is, we have a mission that's laid out as a mission statement, and that is to deal with advancing constitutional policing and accountability for APD and the Albuquerque community. So I think it's important to remind ourselves what our mission is. And I think that as we look at getting the kind of training that NACO offers, for example, and so solve some of our lengthy meeting times. It's more on the tasks that are described in the ordinance and and not focus on citizen complaints or not, which leads me to the citizen complaint part of the process. I see that the CPOA itself has investigators which are well equipped to deal with these complaints. The result of the investigation is generally a fair. The purpose of it is to create a fair review of the citizen complaint and then allocate discipline as it's called for. Urging me to use that information, as Mr. Galloway mentioned, that policy and training. So what you do, sort of separate those two functions. So that essentially the agency investigates the complaint, finds the discipline, and or uses the information from complaints to deal with policy issues. And I think that's where you have, that's where some clarification exists in this process. So I think those are the three main points. The other issue of reviewing serious use of force cases. I think this is, I've been the person on the board who put this together, and I think this is an ongoing process that we laid out in an actual SOP. What the board, the role in this review. SOP is APD's SOP, of course, and we've had conversations. Finding this process. And so I think this is something that's sort of an internal process within the agency and the board to come to a better understanding. I'm not sure there's really.
And Dr. Cass, I'm sorry, we can't hear you. We can't hear you at all. You're breaking up tremendously.
Let me,
Perhaps we can move to another board member or something, Dr. Cass, until you can get that taken care of, because it's a constant breakup.
You log out and log back in, Bill, that might help.
Yep.
Just a reconnection.
right, how about this?
That sounds good.
That's better?
Yes.
Okay. All right, good. So you want me, I hate to start over.
I think we got some of the gist of what you were saying, but yeah, if you want to kind of summarize.
Okay, well, I think that, essentially there's three areas that I care about, and that are that I think that the ordinance can address, and that is board selection and training. I think we need to select community members who are willing to learn what the mission of the board is, and then provide that mission information. And then have the time to be able to deal with daytime meetings and essentially the prioritization to fulfill their membership obligations. Then I think we ought to deal with the mission of the agency much more directly. I think we need to create we need to have a constant process of re-understanding and making this a common understanding among board members as to what the actual mission of the board is, so that we focus on the things such as policy, citizen complaints in the manner that I described earlier, but essentially policy, serious use of force case review, and citizen complaints. Then I think that regarding there needs to be clarification on the role of the board versus the role of the agency in dealing with citizen complaints. The role of the agency, I think, is to do a fair investigation of a citizen complaint. And we recently have had, there's discussion, and I think it's part of the findings of the subcommittee that dealt with this regarding allowing unlimited appeals or anyone to appeal a case. I think that this goes that flies against the integrity of the investigation that was done to begin with the agency itself. And I think it also ends up taking a lot of time away from the real mission of the board, which should be to use that citizen complaint information to create policy and training recommendations. So that's kind of a summary of what I tried to say and with a bad microphone. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Cass. Mr. Nixon, you got on just a little bit late. You want to introduce yourself, and then we'll just keep going around the horn here.
Yeah, my name's Eric Nixon. I'm on the CPOE board. Been there for a couple of years now. I served on the CPCs before, so glad to be here. Thanks.
Thanks for being here. Mr. Crawford, do you want to go next?
Certainly. I'll avoid being too repetitive because I think that Chair Galloway and member Dr. Cass covered a lot of the same thoughts that I have. I did just want to reemphasize a couple of things that they've mentioned. The first is modifications to the board's role in the case review process. I think everyone kind of agrees that the situation is sort of untenable right now in terms of the amount of time that consumes. I do think that involvement in case review is an important way for the board to obtain information that leads directly to policy recommendations. And so I hate to see an elimination of that scope. Something that I've discussed in the past is moving towards more of a random audit model, or in some other way, developing a method for the board to remain involved enough in the case review process to have access to that information for policy purposes, and also to hopefully contribute to the high quality of those investigations, but without having the situation we have right now where it feels like the board is frequently repeating the agency's work. Another thought as well that is something I was not very happy about in this amendment or in the proposed amendment are the changes to training. There's been pretty serious problems with a lot of the trainings that were not required by the CASA, but rather by the ordinance being difficult to obtain. I'm not very happy with eliminating those training courses as requirements, though. Some of them seem really important to the function of the board. In particular, I think awareness of IA policies and of the training that APD officers receive is really critical to being effective in a policy oversight role. It's frustrating that, despite those trainings being required, they've been so difficult to obtain, and sort of addressing that by dropping the requirement seems like it just really ensures that those trainings will never be offered. And that will be a real loss, I think, to the efficacy of the board. And then a couple of other thoughts that are, I think, more responsive to the floor amendments that we saw. As a general principle, I do support introducing a stipend for board members. I think that'll help to improve the accessibility of positions on the board to the public. I do feel like, as is right now, the time obligation and some of the sort of morale issues involved, I think, are probably a bigger impediment to obtaining board members and retaining board members than the pay issue per se. So I don't object to that change. I'm just a little hesitant. I'm worried that it won't maybe achieve the outcomes that we might hope for. And finally, there was a floor amendment that substantially changed the composition of the board. The reduction from 9 members to 5 members is not something that I'm really upset about. I would maybe tend to agree that 9 members seems kind of large for the board. The two things that I objected to a lot more were, first, the move towards using a chair who's appointed by the city council and is not a voting member of the board. I think there's been an unfortunate feeling over the last sort of 6 months that I've been involved in this process that there is a degree of disconnection and sometimes acrimony between the board and the city council. I'm worried that a situation where the city council appoints a chair to the board who's not elected from the board's membership, that feels to me like something that might kind of make that situation worse rather than better. And moreover, my concern was about the composition requirements that were in that floor amendment. If I don't have it in front of me, but if I remember correctly, it specifies the board should have 5 members. And then I think 2 to 3 should be from a law enforcement background, 2 to 3 from the CPCs, and then 1 general member. I'm pretty uncomfortable with the idea that a board of 5 people would potentially consist of 3 members with a law enforcement background. That would be exactly following the recommendations in that floor amendment. And that feels to me like it would definitely have the appearance of pretty significantly compromising the CPOA's independence from law enforcement. And I think that's really everything I have to add. Besides that, just thank you so much for this opportunity and for working on these amendments.
Thank you, Member Crawford. And just a couple of responses quickly. One, with regard to the audit and reporting to the board, this proposal does still include that. It does, however, alleviate them from having to approve findings. And then the other aspect, I think, minor correction, it wasn't law enforcement, it was involved with the criminal justice system. So you could be a public defender, a retired public defender. We even used the example of you might have participated as a person who was being prosecuted within the system, if you wanted to read that broadly. But point well taken. And we may have certainly gone too far on the reduction of the size of the board. So, but anyway, these are things that we need to hear, and we appreciate it. Let's see. We'll go with Member French first, and then Member Nixon.
Thank you. As I said, we've been going over the ordinance line by line by line, but I'll just highlight some of the things that have stood out to me as a board member. Number one, I think that every citizen should have a right to appeal the agency's decision or findings, and they don't. Currently, you have to find an SOP violation, or it has to be something so egregious. And I've brought up several examples to the members of this committee where, an average 18-year-old or average citizen would not know all of that information. So we've looked back at the original way that they used to do it, where any citizen could appeal. I think that's a big issue that we need to address. As far as the composition of the board, we have a lot of work to do. I don't think that 5 people could do it. I certainly don't think that putting requirements on board members, this is supposed to be a fair representation of the citizens of Albuquerque. I don't think that the average citizen has had police background or been a part of the CPC. It does take a lot of dedication and work. Personally, I don't want to be paid. I wouldn't take it even if you would allow it, because I'm not here for that. I'm here to help APD, because how many people are willing to put their lives on the line for you every day, and to help the citizens who now feel that sometimes they're being mistreated by public safety officers. So my ultimate goal is to look at trends and to make recommendations on policies and procedures. As far as the investigations, citizen complaints are concerned, I made a recommendation the other day that we do it like other committees that I've sat on, boards that I've sat on. You have a consent agenda. And if a board member sees something that they would like to pull on that from a certain investigation, they would be able to pull it, and to have random audits. I understand that you're saying that the agency does fair investigations, but there always has to be checks and balances. I don't care who it is, there has to be checks and balances. So having a history of working for APD for 30 years, I will let you know that the Citizen Police Academy was a learning experience. I didn't feel like I needed it. I didn't really want to go, but I will say I enjoyed it. I even went to classes that were not required. I agree that is something that every board member should have to take. It is Tuesday and Thursday for 3 hours for about 9, 10, 12 weeks. But it is something that if you're going to make decisions, that if findings are correct from IA or from whoever, from the director, you need some knowledge of the training and what officers are exposed to every day. You can't make that decision from one-sided or one point of view. So as I said, we're having a meeting this evening where we're going to be going over all the changes that the board, that the committee has gone over line by line in the ordinance. So I will have more information once that information is vetted by all board members and we all agree on what changes we would like to see. So I will just leave it at that because there's too many changes that we would like to recommend.
Thank you, Member French. And just quickly, not in the form of rebuttal or anything, I just get some information just to make clarity. There is still a provision that anyone may appeal the board's decision. And that's still in the language. And then the proposal does include audit and reporting to the board. Continues to have that. It only alleviates, we talked about the findings, but the board does have discretion in hearing the appeal. So maybe that's what you're getting at, but we're happy to hear what you come up with this evening. Board Member Nixon, how about yourself?
Talking on mute. Sorry about that. Can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So I've heard all the other members. It seems like we're kind of across the board, agreeing on some things and kind of disagreeing on, not so much disagreeing, but coming at it of a different view, which is what I think the board is supposed to do as it reaches a consensus. But overall, I can say that my experience being on the board has been somewhat lackluster, and it's not because of the members of the board or anything like that, as much as the role of the board and the role of the CPOA and being able to affect change at APD has been kind of lackluster and somewhat disappointing in my opinion. When I think about what I'm doing on the board and why I'm serving on this board, to be honest with you, I'm here for the people of Albuquerque and for the community. And the intention is not so much to help APD or harm APD, but to be an unbiased ear and eye to what's going on and what needs to happen as far as the community is concerned. I've gone through the Citizens Police Academy. I've looked at ordinances ad nauseum, weighed in on some things, put some things in, and I don't see the effect. To be honest with you, I think that this whole process has helped to perpetuate, I guess, an environment of policing that is just not conducive to where Albuquerque should be, according to the great citizens that are in it. The changes that are trying to be made, or the changes that the board should be able to influence at some point, that influence, in my opinion, is just not there. So there's a lot of different things that I'm kind of tussle with to be on the calls month after month and do this work. But I see that the ordinances and the policy changes and recommendations definitely do come out. But what I think is one of the most disappointing things is knowing and understanding the entire process. As a board member, I get a nice little package called a use of force case and a PowerPoint presentation with redacted film, so on and so forth. And I get to see some of the things that have happened. And then based on that, I'm to make some sort of assumption or just come to my conclusions. I don't think that there's a transparency. And of course, that makes sense because you've got three entities that are, for lack of a better term, in kind of a tango, if you will. And so those three entities pretty much influence what we can and cannot do. And that would be the APD itself, the Department of Justice, and of course the City Council. And so I think that this is somewhat flushing it out. I'm listening. I'm participating. I'm trying to understand what's going on from day to day and from month to month. But that's kind of what I see. And I think that people are working hard to try to solidify the process so that we can make policing better in this community. I really don't see where we can continue to have some of the IMR reports that come across the desk where it seems to me, just my opinion, the APD is just fighting it. They're refusing between them and the union. They don't, they don't want to adhere. They don't want to make these adjustments that may need to be made so that it's indicative to the community that there are actually processes and changes that are being made. Because I think there is work being done behind the scenes. But I think that when you have a priority of redaction, hiding, avoidance, accountability, especially, which is probably the big one, then you're going to have these kind of issues. So as far as limiting the board down to 5 people, I don't agree with that 100%. I think the representation across the board should be as diverse as the Albuquerque community, and putting limitations on people as far as who wants to serve on the board. I don't think taxpayers pay their taxes and adhere to the laws of this land and do things like that so that they can be excluded based on the fact of whether or not they've served in law enforcement or not, or if they have a high school diploma or not, or et cetera, et cetera. I think that we really need to get back to the grassroots of what it is we were trying to do when James Boyd was killed. And seeing some of the things that are going on and what the idea of having a CPOA was supposed to do as far as serving the community, and allowing the process to do exactly that, but also identify where those bottlenecks are and then remove those bottlenecks or adjust or make changes to them. So again, if you tell me, it's sort of like shut up and dribble. If you tell me, this is what the CPOA is supposed to do, we make the recommendations, people may or may not adhere to them or agree with them, and so on and so forth, this is just what we're supposed to do, then we're always going to be ineffective. But if we can understand how our recommendations and how our time being spent to go through ordinances and make recommendations, and so on and so forth, where we can get outcomes to that, where I can see, okay, where this is what we put in, this is what came out of that, then I think it would be a much better and much easier for a citizen like myself to serve on this board. So.
All right, thank you, Member Nixon. I just wanted to ask, let's see, please use your hand raise. I'm happy to recognize counselors in order on this, but I think Mr. Melendres may have some comments with regard to the drafting of the ordinance revisions.
Sure, Mr. President and counselors and members of the CPOA board. So myself, and I know our council staff has been taking notes on all the good comments, so certainly appreciate those. And I think I'll only echo a couple of things that you mentioned, Councilor Benton, which the intent in the ordinance was to continue to have a process wherein the board would be able to review the various complaints that are being investigated. However, right now, the ordinance places responsibility upon them for actually approving, the individual findings within an investigation, even if that investigation doesn't result in a disciplinary recommendation to the police department. So that would be the component of the ordinance that is being removed. And again, that's not a requirement of the city's settlement agreement with the Department of Justice. And it may have been leading to some of the overload that the board has quite frankly experienced with respect to what it's being asked to do. And so I think I heard Ms. French say that they were going to be doing more of a deep dive on the ordinance and maybe giving some more direct feedback on that. So that'll definitely be helpful if there are places within the ordinance where it appears that is happening. Certainly that's not the intent as I understand it, so those could be addressed. Also with respect to the appeal process, that was referenced, section 9419 does still say that any person who has filed a civilian complaint and who is dissatisfied with the findings or recommendations may request a hearing by the board. It does establish 3 criteria that the board should evaluate in granting that hearing, to include whether or not a policy was applied, whether the outcome of the investigation appeared arbitrary or constitute an abuse of discretion, or that the findings and recommendations were not consistent with the record evidence. And so certainly it's within the policy discretion of the council to adjust those criteria if the board were to recommend as much, and that made policy sense. Also, with respect to Member Nixon's comments with respect to being able to implement, meaningful, having some meaning associated directly with the acts that the board is taking. I think one of the overarching principles, at least as I've been directed by the sponsors, is to put these changes in the ordinance, for example, by alleviating the responsibility to approve every single finding on every single complaint, to allow the board to focus more on the big picture policy recommendations that might be developed, and be able to pass those along into the police oversight system in a way that sets up a proactive and hopefully more meaningful implementation of those that the board had a direct responsibility in developing. The ordinance has also always given the board the opportunity, in the event that they feel they are not being heard in a policy perspective by the department or otherwise, to submit policy recommendations that they're developing directly to the city council. And so that's an outlet as well that I don't think the board has exercised previously, but maybe the board should think about and figure out whether or not that is a useful pathway for them to use at some point or not, because that could be on the table as well for part of this amendment process. Those are the only comments that I have. I'd be happy to attempt to answer any questions about the ordinance if those exist. Otherwise, I'm just available, and as well as Ms. Couladon. And I believe Mr. Silban is with us now. I know he had a little bit of a conflict getting started, but we're all here to help fill in any blanks if you need them.
Thank you, Chris. Councilors, any other comments from councilors? I see Councilor Davis has his hand up.
Thank you, Mr. President. It sounds like we're coming to a close, sort of. So I want to just say thank you to the members of the board who were able to come join us today. We had to come up with a way that we could hear from everybody in a setting that wasn't having one-on-one or side conversations, so that we can incorporate everything. And I do appreciate everyone who did that today. I heard a few things that I think, I hear some agreement about the need to really structure the mandated training and ensure that APD is able to provide that training and some accountability. I mean, it sounds silly, but clearly we're not doing a good job at the city of ensuring that the people responsible for overseeing the cops are getting the training they need to evaluate police actions, right or wrong. And I appreciate that we need to do that. I hear some almost universal agreement from members of the board about tying the board's budget back to APD's budget. I agree with that. I lost that vote the first time around. But I also want to ask and hope that the board can give us some more opportunity to do that. I think one of the reasons that change happened early on was because in its oversight role, the board was not, in my opinion, doing a good job of holding the agency accountable to its own budget. Positions that were, say, funded for statisticians and additional investigators weren't filled. The agency's budget was often not utilized effectively, and the board didn't seem to take a role in that. And so I think the council thought it was appropriate to bring that back. I think there are some internal things that we should work on together as we do this, so that Member French's idea about using consent agenda, for example. I know, Patty, you and I've talked about that before, and I think that's an excellent one. It's one we use at the council to move through things. But I think that's something the board can do internally, or at least write up, recommend, and sort of ask for a stamp of approval if they think there's some outside approval needed. But I think the board is doing some good work with the members we have here, sort of with this pared down board before we appoint some new members, to do some of those internal accountability things, to take a leadership role and to redefine its mission. And I want to see us do that before we appoint a new director. Because can't ask somebody to take on a job they don't know what it is. So, Mr. President, thank you for doing this. There are some things I hear some agreement on today, and some other things I think we're really going to have to shuffle through. So I hope we can have a new round of these amendments from the sponsors for public review before our next meeting. And thank you for this.
All right, thanks, Councilor Davis. Councilor Bassan, and then Acting Chair Galloway has her hand up.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wasn't sure if we wanted to hear from Director McDermott herself and her opinions, or if we're just going to rely on the email that was sent. And then also, I wanted to ask, out of everybody that offered these, I've made lots of notes to move forward with how I want to proceed with changes, but are the training, how we eliminated some of the training requirements, we did that thinking that it might be a little less cumbersome, right? And now we're learning, okay, well, did we overdo? Should we put them all back the way it was? Or is it really just the internal affairs that's being recommended? So I'm curious what the board would say about that, and what they would prefer to see as far as what is valuable. Is it an all or none or just some? And so that's one question, Director McDermott. And then the last thing is, if after tonight's meeting, if you're willing to send kind of an update so that we can look at kind of what you all discussed and compare it to Director McDermott's email with our changes, I would be happy to sit with council staff and the co-sponsors, and ideally I would like to come up with a floor sub before, just rather than a whole bunch of amendments. I think that would be really great if we could make that happen ASAP.
I agree with that, Counselor. Ms. Galloway, and then we'll give Ms. McDermott an opportunity to give her thoughts here.
Thank you so much. And Councillor Bassan, to your direct question about which trainings, for me, it's the Police Academy and Internal Affairs absolutely are critical components to training. Touching on something that Mr. Melendrez said, and it's something that we have brought up in the past. I know that the Department of Justice has brought it up, and the monitoring team, but there really needs to be some codification and clarity to the selection process for new members. We received a presentation from Mr. Sylvan last month that kind of gave like a 10,000 foot view, but we need to get into the weeds on that, because that for the 4 years, the entirety of the 4 years that I have been here, has been the biggest problem that we have faced, is appointing members to this board. And again, with the number of applicants that's constantly being shared, I don't know why that problem exists. And so there needs to be some time spent with that. I know there's differences of opinion between board members and agency and whatnot as to whether or not the board and or agency should be a part of that process. I personally have the opinion that we should. I think that there's insights that we have, both from the agency side and from the board perspective, that you cannot know if you're not in it. I don't know that it necessarily means that we're part of the selection process, but right now we're living in this world where everything happens to us and not with us, and it happens to us by people who are not a part of the process. And that would be really helpful if we just did this, had the conversations, shared the insights and the perspectives, but it needs to go down as far as, I think, with the council staff as well, in the process for selecting new members. So I think that's important as well.
Mr. President, if I can just kind of maybe tie a loop there. So thanks for addressing that. I actually don't think I mentioned that in my comments, but I honestly meant to. And so I appreciate you reading my mind or bringing it up. But there's room here for a larger discussion, but I wanted to just let you and counselors know, in the event that we haven't had the opportunity to circle up on it yet. Just this last Friday, we had a pretty intense session with the Department of Justice and monitoring team on the selection process. And we have some information and some material that we can share with the board on how that process looks. The number that was put out, I think you said 170 some applications, and why can't we choose from those? Well, it is accurate that there are a number of folks that have applied, but at the same time, there are criteria that are imposed by the ordinance and the CASA. And so that number isn't exactly accurate in saying just pick one of these 178, because the evaluation process requires that folks be evaluated based on a number of factors, including their diversity across the city, their geographic diversity, their ability to engage independently, to not necessarily be invested in one side of issues or the other. So there's a lot of complexity that goes into that appointment process. And historically, the board, at least it's been our perspective that the board has been or had the opportunity to be involved. And I understand more recently that that may not have been played out in the way that I think that it had been intended. But before folks are appointed to this board, they are sent to go visit with the CPOA. I think that that may have been occurring only at the staff level, but certainly the idea was that they would have the opportunity to meet with board members as well. They're also asked to go sit in on a meeting of the board before being appointed. And so there are these opportunities for that to happen, and certainly they can be more well developed. And so I think the next step would be, I'll get with Mr. Sylvan and we'll make sure that we are discussing all of the presentation material that we prepared in our meeting last week in order to share that with the agency, because the discussion does include and should include the agency's ability to inform and assist in that process, especially in the area of recruitment and retention.
Thank you, Mr. Melendres. And I'm going to turn over to Ms. McDermott. Just really quickly, a little bit of background, right? Going back to the James Boyd era and that entire turnover of the creation of an entirely new agency. I think, my recollection was that there was a lot of pressure for the counselors themselves to have a very long arm's length away from any selection process. And that's how this ended up kind of being the way it's been run, where it's more of a the council staff process. It's further complicated by the fact that council is not really a party to the settlement. That's typically done with the chief executives of cities when DOJ makes one of these settlements. But those are just a couple of clarifications, their background, and I'm not saying it's working. We do need to more transparency in the selection process and a more clear selection process without question. Ms. McDermott.
Thank you, counselors. I just will quickly mention a couple of things that I've heard regarding the budget issue. It's a more complicated, I think, than Councilor Davis had mentioned in terms of the filling of positions and things like that. But generally, what we're concerned with is the opportunity. The council now has been very supportive and good about making sure that the budget is adequate to fulfill the mission. Likewise, the positions, there's been funding for the positions and things like that. So that's been great. The issue is we would want to have at least some minimum standard available to the agency so that there isn't in the future, say the political change of what's important to the councils down the road and things like that, decide to underfund or cut the funding of the oversight process. And so that's the main reason to at least request some sort of a minimum standard. Certainly the agency has to be accountable for how the monies are spent, justify how monies are spent, things like that. Nobody is disagreeing with that or arguing with that, but we just want to put some sort of an assurance for the future that we won't be suffering underfunding. And then just to speak a little bit to Mr. Melendres's point. So those staff meetings or the pre-membership meetings, I understood occurred a long time ago in the past, but they had not been occurring recently. I know in my role anyway, there'd been no meetings or anything. Both Chair Galloway and I have been presented with names just recently as potential individuals, but there hasn't been this involvement by us in any kind of recent history. So I just wanted to bring those couple of things up. I wanted to give the board members the opportunity, since they're bound by OMA, this is the way for them to be able to engage more easily. I have a little bit easier time, obviously, not being bound by that. So.
Dr. Cass.
Yes, thank you. So I just wanted to comment on a couple items. One is the member selection process. And I think the idea that the agency be or the board be involved in that process should be formalized as to what the expectations are. I think it's really important to inform prospective members in advance what this job is. And I think it needs more than just directing them to a website or 3 websites that describe what the ordinance is, what the CASA is, things like that. I think it needs a kind of a much more personal sort of touch to get that information across. And I think that should be coupled with having the training be made more available. That's really the second thing. When I went through the Citizens Police Academy, APD tailored that for members and some other, and actually the DOJ and attended, CPA members attended, but it was given over 2 weekends of 2 days each weekend, 8 hours a day. And so we got the concentrated version, and it was for the subject function of the board. And I think it was well done and well put together. The advantage was that it was also interactive, and that we had actually did some pushback at this training on the trainers, which I don't think they were used to. I know they weren't used to that at the time, because that wasn't how the Citizens Academy was presented. But I think that interaction is a good interaction. I think if there's a requirement for the CPA, I think it should be in a modified way. And I know that that's occurred in this most recent go around, and that they selected sessions that are important. But I think to make it more specific for the board or CPC members, as opposed to just the normal police academy, I think that makes it a lot more valuable, because you can get much more interaction. So I think all of this goes to my point that we need the specific training dealing with oversight and understanding how APD operates in order to do that oversight. And so I think that all works together, because I think ultimately we're engaged in a collaborative process. This is where, this comes from Dr. Ginger, and that is relentless or applied. And I think that's the point here, is that we're trying to do a culture change. And I think we're part of that. So it doesn't just start by, or it isn't all about reviewing a serious use of force case and saying, okay, here's where things went wrong and here's what we disagree with. But it's changing those policies and the training that we learn from reviewing a serious use of force case. And that takes time to go through, trickle down through the process. And so that's, I think that's one of the frustrations of being on the board, is you can't really see that what the impact is that you're having. It's not immediate, it's not direct, it's gradual. So I think it's important to recognize that that's going to be one of the things that that you have to deal with if you're going to be on the board. That's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Cass. Member Crawford, and we are over our time already, so we are going to need to wrap this up in a few minutes. I actually have to get to another meeting myself.
Yeah, thank you. Just a few quick thoughts. First, on the member selection process, I think the process by which I was selected suffered a great deal from having been very rushed. I know very few council members spoke to me, but I think there was also really one business day to do so. So that's not surprising. This, I think, 60-day timeline in the proposed amendments made me a little nervous from that perspective, just because I don't want to see that become, I don't want to see it stay as rushed as it has been in my experience. When it comes to the audit function, I think some of the discomfort that I expressed, and I think I've heard from others there, just comes from the specific way it's worded in the ordinance right now. The audit function has been a little odd. We don't pay a lot of attention to looking at 10% of cases, because we look at all cases. That would be different, obviously, after these amendments. I don't really like it being one annual event, though. That seems cumbersome. And I think at kind of a high level, I would like the board to have more control over how that process occurs. And finally, I think the Citizens Police Academy has been one of the big points of contention on training. I do think I have not had the opportunity to do it yet. I do think that material will be important, but I also think that the fixed scheduling on that in the 12-week duration means that just because of the scheduling, it ends up being a pretty substantial impediment to board members. And part of that is because there is certainly a strong feeling right now that there are a lot of eyes on the specific training deadlines My heart sunk recently when I looked at a calendar and realized that I will exceed my initial 6 months without completing the required training. And that's simply because of the date that the CPA is starting compared to when I was appointed. So I think the CPA would be something that maybe made us less nervous if perhaps the deadlines on the CPA specifically were a little more relaxed, considering that it's long and offered infrequently.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, unless anyone else has a final point they would like to make, I want to thank the board members for attending, and you give us plenty to think about, and we actually do, as Councilor Basan mentioned, are very interested in seeing any formal recommendations that you come up with tonight. You know, I'll speak for the co-sponsors. I think we're all just trying to make sense of this ourselves. We don't have an agenda. We appreciate your service. We want to have a complete board and streamline, but also make more transparent the appointment process. So that's all on us to collectively, yourselves and ourselves, to try to get this right. And I think that's everyone's intention. So thanks for your time, and I'm sure we'll see you soon.
Thank
Bye
you
now.
all.